Welcome back to the François debate. Part 2. Is NATO obsolete, as Donald Trump says, or is it the bedrock of transatlantic cooperation, as his defence secretary told the meeting in Brussels this Wednesday? Maybe it's both. Either way, these are the facts. NATO has deployed almost 20,000 personnel across the world. Afghanistan, Kosovo, the Mediterranean, the Horn of Africa. NATO is working with the African Union to help keep the peace in several countries as we speak. NATO is helping solve the refugee crisis, which is caused by the war against jihadists in Syria and Iraq. And in Turkey, there are NATO Patriot missiles and AWACS aircraft. All this without mentioning the missile shield, which is the project in Eastern Europe. Vladimir Putin, of course, not liking that being installed one bit. Some might say he's right to have that approach. That project, of course, governed from NATO's base in Germany. So, what future for NATO, with or without the US? Big meeting today. Mattis, the new chief at the Pentagon, saying that the NATO countries, all 28, have to cough up more cash in order to not risk America reconsidering or moderating its commitments. Let's introduce our guests once again. Joining us by Skype from Tallinn in Estonia, Molly McHugh, foreign policy consultant and information war expert. Molly, thanks for being with us. By satellite from Washington, D.C., Yasha Munk, who is a lecturer on government at Harvard and also an expert on all these issues. Great to hear from you. Great for you to be there. Kyle Norton joins us from the Wirral in the UK. Kyle is a research fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Kyle, thanks for being with us. And here in the studio, Benoit d'Abouville, former French ambassador to NATO. Thank you, sir, too. We've discussed, obviously, this idea that what Donald Trump said was very, very hurtful, very painful. Kyle Orton saying, once you said NATO is obsolete, you can't take it back. That's the problem. It's been very damaging, hasn't it, saying that?
Yes, at the start, but I think the cooler head will.
Is a cooler head possible with Trump? That's the question.
Not, but around him, I think, and you have, for example, a senator like McCain, which has been with NATO since 10 years, 15 years. One question which is not asked by the American press and by the president is the fact that the US benefits enormously from NATO. It's not a question of money only. It's a question of days, logistics. When Netanyahu was in Washington, the president said unbreakable alliance. But in order to defend Israel, the Americans need their base in Europe. And it's for them it is a logistical platform.
Of course, Turkey, of course, the
Turkey, but only Spain and so forth. At the same time, in the relationship with Russia, which is the key of the essence of NATO, they need to have their ally because Russia. Obvious objective is to divide Europe from the US. And NATO was precisely founded for that. And NATO had, in the past, existential crisis. When the Warsaw Pact disappeared, a lot of people say,
if there's no Warsaw Pact,
NATO?
Why do we need NATO?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that we had Bosnia, we had Afghanistan, we had terrorism, and so forth. And
see ongoing operations in Africa too.
Yeah, well, in Africa will be NATO is speaking of Africa, but I think that only EU and the French are in Africa. The NATO in Africa is PR.
France spending 1.3 billion.
We would like to have other allied, but in fact, NATO in Africa.
Let me bring in some of the other guests, please, if you would mind, Benoit. Benoit, our former French ambassador to NATO. Molly, I'll bring you back in. Molly in Estonia, in Tallinn there. Benoit was mentioning Ukraine, and obviously with Estonia being a former Soviet state once upon a time, there is, we are told, the fear that people might have there that Vladimir Putin could swoop at some point. Is that something that people are really, it preoccupies people in Tallinn? Is that true?
I think it's very hard to understand how people view Russia from out here, unless you're out here, where there are constantly discussions about how you would defend against attack, and regular, normal people sort of sit in cafes and talk about what their evacuation plan is and how they would get their family out, and and what they would do if there was, sort of the wall of Russians coming over the border again.
So it's a feeling, it's a present danger then?
Absolutely. But I think the concern here and in Ukraine and elsewhere, I mean, Ukraine is in a hot war that we all deny is happening. But I think the concern in the Baltic states is less, at this time in particular, sort of a Russian army coming over the wall as it is these sort of creeping attacks, the shadow war that we are very bad at identifying and calling out quickly and in responding to effectively. Not just cyber attacks, not just hacking, but the information war, the influence war, the Russian money that's used to buy access and influence politics and decision-making, and other things. And there's sort of this entire fabric of the Gerasimov strategy to attack the West as part of Russia's hybrid war that we really haven't focused on coherently. We have not developed an alliance strategy for, and that needs to be a clear part of what NATO is focusing on. I think Estonia and the other sort of easternmost allies who feel the Russian thumb and the Russian fist around them more presently have a lot to contribute in terms of identifying the threat. And that's where we really need to start, is sort of going back and seeing the war and understanding that NATO is our best defense against the threats that we face.
Molly, bear with us. And can I just say to you and to our other guests who are beyond the studio joining us by Skype, of course, if you have anything to contribute at any point, don't be afraid to speak. I will try to bring you in and try to regulate how things work. Leave that to me. That's my problem. Quickly, Benoit, from you.
Yes, at the Warsaw Summit last summer, NATO took the hybrid warfare case and the cyber case as element of its posture. So in a way, NATO has taken on board those issues which were just mentioned. The real issue now for NATO is, I think, Ukraine and sanctions, because there is a risk of division between some people in Washington asking for removing of a sanction.
We're led to believe that it was already a done deal, and that's why Flynn had to go.
Yeah, exactly, because he lied on that. It was not very clear. But at that, you can expect that Mrs. Merkel and François Hollande, which worked on the Minsk II agreement, which is the only base for a political situation. Now the issue is that Putin had, with Georgia and Syria, he gambled right, and there was no reaction. Now, the issue is how to make the risk of anything in the Baltic state so great for Putin as a reaction that it is not worth the gamble. That is deterrence.
Let's go to Washington. Yasha Monk, and picking up from what Bumba just said about, in order to stop anything happening in the Baltics, they've got to make the risk for Putin seem so great. If you have Donald Trump in the White House, does that risk, from Putin's perspective, feel less threatening?
It absolutely does, and I frankly think that a lot of people in Europe are still in denial about it. And frankly, I think that from what I hear from European officials and former officials, including Benoit in this show, I think that people are not taking the threat seriously enough. As Molly was saying, we are not acknowledging the hot war in the Ukraine. We who are sitting in capitals in France and Paris and Berlin do not understand how worried people, for good reason, are feeling in the Baltic countries. And there's a deep instinct among the sort of transatlantic elite in Europe to think that things can't possibly change in the United States, that cooler heads will prevail. You know what? They're asking us to up to 2%. Perhaps we should be more worried about making provisions for our own defense, but in the end, the United States will always be there. We are now in a rapidly changing political world in which populists can take over governments, align themselves with governments that do not care about the liberal world order, that do not care even about the sanctity of the borders of sovereign territory in Europe, as in Russia. And we really have to start thinking about how to confront those threats, which come in forms like cyber warfare, as Molly was saying, but which also may mean that part of the European alliance is going to crumble. I don't think that anybody in Europe is asking themselves seriously enough a question of what happens if somebody like Marine Le Pen might win in France, or if populists end up winning in other countries, like, say, the Netherlands and so on. A lot of the idea for how we're going to defend ourselves in Europe is one of military cooperation, in which, to caricature a little bit, the French bring the tanks and the Germans bring the planes, because famously we don't have any tanks, and the Dutch bring the field hospital and the Belgians bring the intelligence. Well, what happens if the government of the Netherlands is suddenly allied with Russia and they're not going to bring the field hospital because they refuse to take part in the mission? Well, then you basically have the populist's veto. The person who is least hostile to Russia, the person who is most comfortable with letting Russia run wild in Central Europe, can suddenly block any real joint European military action. So I think we have to think much more carefully about what European defense would look like if cooler heads will not prevail in Washington, D.C., and if some not so cool heads keep gaining power in other European countries as well.
Yasha, thank you very much. And don't hesitate to chip in if you have any thoughts. You mentioned Marine Le Pen, Yasha. I mean, clearly, what we know here in France is that Russia has chipped into the Front National, the National Front campaign. So there's an element of Russian support there. And Russian propaganda news media setting up in France to, we are told, back her campaign, support her campaign, and do the kind of fake news spreading which might support that. And one of the candidates, Emmanuel Macron, is saying at this point that he is being targeted because he doesn't have a pro-Russia stance. So clearly what you're saying, there's something happening there. Kyle Orton in the World is one of the issues that this whole NATO thing, the whole project in many ways is nebulous, and people don't appreciate what they've got.
I don't think so. I think there was a time, especially when the Soviet Union was still here, that everybody fully understood what was happening. It's obviously had evolution since the end of the Cold War. But just to go back to what the last guest was saying,
Please do.
The thing is that the alliance has already frayed to a significant extent. I mean, Trump comes in inheriting a really quite difficult situation. In Eastern Europe, you have Russian aggression back on the table as a real option. Russia currently occupies part of Ukraine. It's stolen Crimea. It threatens the Baltics fairly regularly and fairly openly. In Syria, the Russians are back now in the Middle East as a power broker, and they not only didn't receive pushback. In September, the Obama administration tried to make a direct military pact to work with the Russians, retrospectively giving a political stamp of legitimacy to their intervention as well. And in Turkey, you have the United States' main ground asset in the war against the Islamic State being a terrorist group that the Turks regard as their main security threat. So these problems are all landing in Trump's lap now, and he's having to try and untangle them. Now, it's not to say that there aren't troublesome elements about Trump and the people around him, because there clearly are, as we just saw by the resignation on Monday. But it is to say that anybody inheriting that situation would have inherited an emboldened and aggressive Russia, and recontaining it would have been deeply troublesome no matter the circumstances, even if they were fortunate, which of course they're not.
And as you mentioned, it is a complicated situation, very complicated indeed. We report on it every day here at France 24, and all around the world people talk about it. And you point out very, very difficult things to sort out. What should NATO do from here is the question I would pose to everybody. Molly, can I bring you in on this one? Can you start and we see where we go?
I think what everyone has been hinting at is very much the truth. The American component of the alliance has always been the steel that holds NATO together. It is the force, it is the threat, it is the thing that everyone knows is sort of keeping the alliance on track and provides a real deterrent to Russia and to other potential aggression. I think we need that commitment to be there, and there's this bizarre duality where you have the normal parts of American power, sort of military and intelligence voices, and the Secretary of Defense continuing forward with the right rhetoric and sort of focus, and you have this great uncertainty about the president and his commitments and the people around him and their own beliefs in this bizarre populist world order allied with Putin and what they want to try to build. I think there is a real threat to our countries and our alliance. I think we need to be very clear about it. And I think that this idea that our voters and our electorates don't really understand NATO and don't really want it and don't really appreciate it is partially because we don't communicate to them anymore about the threats that we face clearly, and we don't communicate to them about the values of the alliance and what America gets out of NATO, not just what we put into it. All of this is important going forward. But I think the alliance does need a clear, concise, revised, transformative vision for itself moving forward, because there is no better alternative for all of our national defense and security for terrorism.
I very much
Go ahead, Yasha.
Yeah, I very much agree with Molly that it's not difficult to tell people that you need military spending when you make clear that there is a real threat. For 20 or 30 years, European publics had good reason to want to reduce military spending because Europe looked like a very peaceful neighborhood. And so why spend money if it looks like you're not really threatened? Now there is a real threat, and good political leadership can explain that and make that clear to people. So I think that I'm not going to speak to what NATO should do as an entity, because I think it's mostly a question of what European countries can do in response to the United States. And I don't get the impression that anybody in the United States is listening to me or Molly or Benoit or Carl. So I think we should address the people who might be listening. And there's three very obvious things you need to do. The first is to clearly increase military spending, because it allows you both to give greater value to NATO from the American perspective and to actually have better provisions for your own defense if the United States really continues to reduce its commitment. The second is to really rethink what European military cooperation would look like. You do want to have some amount of redundancy in your capacities. The complete consensus is that you don't want to double up anything. But the point is that each country, especially each big country like Germany or France, needs to be able to defend itself on its own, because we're entering a populist age in which you don't know who's going to stand with you. But you should think about how to cooperate with governments whenever possible and increase the capacities for that. And the third point that I want to add is that so far we've been talking about North America and Western Europe. We have a liberal world order which is crucial to the provision of public goods throughout the world and security throughout the world. And NATO is one very big part of it, but it has effects well beyond the transatlantic space. And so now we have to think about, in an era in which the United States is not committed to the liberal world order, the supposed leader of a free world is not committed to that world order, how do we bring in countries like India, like Indonesia, like Nigeria? How do we change the liberal world order a little bit to give them a real stake in that world, so that in a time when the United States is not defending it, they can come to the rescue of it to a certain degree. Yeah. And that too is something that European politicians would be well placed to explore.
Yeah, I need to stop you there. Thank you very much indeed. And of course, one wonders what happens beyond that. China, of course, President Bannon, as some people call him, talking about conflict happening there at some point. Benoit.
It's obvious that Asia will be the next ground for geopolitical debate. But there is a danger if you really want to extend NATO to a kind of League of Democracy, as it was proposed 10 years ago by Madeleine Albright, with India, Pakistan, and so forth. At that point, you dilute NATO to the point where the local public opinion don't understand anything. That is the first danger. The second thing is to avoid loose talk. We had Giuliani.
Are you saying those countries shouldn't be brought in to?
No, they are already partners. It's worked perfectly. They are partner of NATO. But the fact that the alliance should become a league of democracy or a league of U.S. partners around the world seems to me a bit too much for just the acceptance by the European public opinion. The second thing is, of course, to avoid loose talk. We had, for example, Giuliani, former mayor of New York, was a candidate for the State Department. He was saying, well, Riga is not worth a war because it is a suburb of St. Petersburg. But of course, then you understand that the Baltic public opinion is a bit wary about who is surrounding the friend.
And it seems remarkable that he could have said that, given what we've heard from Molly.
Exactly. And then the third thing is, let us discuss really in depth what is the burden sharing. Who is getting what from the expenditure? The budget of NATO is peanuts. It's 1.5 billion. The budget of the US is 650 billions. So let's really go back to the basic. Who is spending to what? And then the last point is obviously that we should have a policy toward Russia. Because Russia in the past was almost a partner of NATO. And then in around 77, Putin said no, and the missile shield was one of the factors. So Ukraine, missile shield, Baltic, not to speak about Georgia. That's a lot of balls to juggle together.
Georgia 2008. Kyle Orton, a final word from you, sir. We're getting towards the end of our debate. Is it time to recalibrate with Russia, bring Russia in some way? Is that what Trump is getting at? Is it possible?
No, I mean, I think he has to try. Not just because of his own campaign rhetoric, but I think it can't be the Western alliance that's seen to push people away. And so once he tries to engage, and say in Syria, for example, when he tries to form some sort of deal to stabilize the country, and he finds that Russia is intimately tied to the Iranian Revolution and to the Assad government and isn't going to let it go. And then you can move into actually containing and deterring Russia. But I agree with Benoit that it's back to basics. Allies need to be reassured and Russia needs to be deterred. There need to be credible and enforceable red lines, to coin a phrase.
We need to leave it there. Kyle Orton, Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. Thank you, sir, for joining us. Thanks to our other guests, to Molly McHugh, who joined us from Tallinn, Estonia, where people are talking in the cafes, Molly said, about the threat from Russia, which I find it makes you shiver to think about it, doesn't it? Yasha Monk joining us from Washington, D.C. as well. Thank you, sir, very much indeed. And thanks to Benoit Doubleville here in the studio. Great to see you, sir. Thank you for your opinions. That concludes our France 24 debate. Stay with us. Media Watch is next. Our guests are still in position. Emma James joins us too in her position. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Okay, so tell us what's being said online and across the media on this issue. It seems Donald Trump isn't the only one questioning the future of NATO.
Yes, it's very easy to think of NATO as having this kind of mythical status that it's above reproach, but it does seem that there are quite a few people out there who think things need to change. If we take a look at this article in The Telegraph, the British newspaper, it's written by two people, one a former national security advisor to the Spanish government, the other a former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. And what they say is that Trump is right to say that NATO is obsolete. They say that for 5 decades, NATO was absolutely necessary. They quote its first Secretary General as having said it was there to keep the Soviets out, the Americans in, and the Germans down, but times change. And they talk about the fact that, there have been calls for NATO to be dismantled since the 1990s. Others, though, have always said it needs to be kept there as something of a safety net. But what they say is that it's fundamental now for NATO to reform and to address the problem of Islamic terrorism, because that is the number one concern right now. They say it has to revamp, reform, and it could be that, according to them, Trump is just the man to make NATO relevant again. Now, looking elsewhere, as that article points out, Trump may have shocked people in January when he referred to NATO as obsolete, but it's not the first time they've been criticised. This article from the New York Times, June 2011, had the then Defence Secretary Robert Gates warning NATO that its future was dim at best, dismal at worst. He talks about shortages in military spending and political will, and says that more member nations will have to scale up their participation in the alliance's activities. All sounds very familiar if you've been following what Mr. Trump has had to say on the issue. Looking elsewhere, Foreign Policy have a piece that really looks ahead to the future. It's an imagining of September 2020, NATO is no longer. The Brussels HQ has been shuttered, and it's quite a strange article, but it is quite interesting to look at. It talks about how the long whimper of NATO's demise began with the inauguration of Donald Trump, and that his reforms essentially killed off those alliances. They say he got his allies to pay more, but he also guaranteed that they would care less. What's rather sweet to notice, he does seem to think that in 2020 caring is going to be in short supply. Absorbed as we are in the new world disorder, nobody seems to care. He quotes an imaginary security guard who actually closed up the Brussels HQ. When he was asked, where's the key, he said, I think it's at home in my top drawer. Nobody asked me for it.
The fallout from the resignation of the US National Security Advisor, General Flynn, still the subject of much fascination, and it's made him, Michael Flynn, the butt of a few jokes stateside. Do explain.
Yes, absolutely. Well, US comedy right now is very much focused on politics. It always has been, but more so now than ever. And it's not just Saturday Night Live. Stephen Colbert, too, is now attracting some of his biggest audiences in a very long time, perhaps even ever. And it's down to the fact that he is making these regular anti-Trump jokes. And he has a rather more down-to-earth style, less exaggerated than some comics that we see on US late-night TV. Last night, he ripped into the newly defrocked Michael Flynn, and his apparent lack of awareness that calls to Russia would be monitored. Let's take a listen.
After it was revealed there were recordings of his conversation, Flynn went from absolutely not to he couldn't be certain that the topic never came up. I know one way you could be certain. As the National Security Advisor, you could ask for the transcript. Could I see that, please? Oh. I should really not have this job. It's funny because it's treason.
Funny indeed.
Funny because it's treason. Donald Trump has reacted to the crisis within the security services in his typical fashion. The real scandal here is that classified information is illegally given out by intelligence like candy, he has tweeted. Very un-American, according to Donald Trump.
Emma James, thank you very much indeed. Thanks again to our guests for this debate. Thank you, Bumma, for being with us. A pleasure to have your input and your analysis. That was the France 24 debate. Stay with us here. More news to come.